Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my channel? Thank you so much. A royal execution was never just about death. It was theater, meticulously staged, brutally choreographed, and calibrated down to the last breath. In Tudor England, no punishment was private, no disgrace was personal. A scaffold was a stage, and the condemned were performers, often unwilling, sometimes unaware, but always central to the show. The king was the playwright, the executioner a brutal technician, and the crowd the audience, but also the message's target. These gatherings were tools of control, spectacles designed to shape public perception. The bodies might break, but the real goal was to bend the mind. To be executed publicly under a monarch like Henry VIII was to become part of an orchestration of fear and obedience. The ritual was precise. The procession to the scaffold, the final speech, the swift blow, the blood-soaked wood. Each element existed to reinforce a singular idea. This is what happens when you defy the king. For decades, this formula worked. Crowds cheered the downfall of traitors. They wept when queens were disgraced. They watched, silent and awestruck, as noble heads fell, believing they were witnessing the enactment of divine justice, not political convenience. But on a hot July morning in 1540, something went wrong. The king's carefully crafted illusion faltered. The scaffold, once a place of fear and compliance, turned into a stage for collective resistance, not with riots or weapons, but with something more dangerous: sympathy, mourning, disbelief. When Thomas Cromwell, once the king's most trusted advisor, was led to the block, he was supposed to be reviled. After all, he had engineered the deaths of others. He had been the iron hand behind Henry's most controversial policies. The narrative was simple. Cromwell was a villain brought low by justice. But as the blade was raised, something in the crowd shifted. The silence wasn't reverence, it was shock. People cried, some prayed, others turned their backs, unwilling to witness what no longer felt like justice. For the first time in Henry's reign, the people mourned a man the king had condemned. The crowd turned, not violently, not with rebellion, but with a devastating quiet disapproval that Henry could neither predict nor undo. This wasn't just an execution gone wrong. It was a moment of rupture, a crack in the facade of absolute power, and it terrified the court more than any uprising. To understand why this single moment unnerved the monarchy, we must understand the man it destroyed and the man who destroyed him. Thomas Cromwell was not born for execution. He was born for obscurity. The son of a Putney blacksmith, he had no noble blood, no patronage, no hereditary claim to power. And yet, for a brief, searing moment in Tudor history, he stood higher than dukes, closer to the king than any nobleman, and more fear than the sword that would one day sever his neck. His rise was improbable. A street brawler, a soldier for hire in Italy, a merchant, a banker, a lawyer. Cromwell moved through Europe like a shadow, gathering language skills and secrets. By the time he returned to England, he was not just educated, he was weaponized. But it wasn't intellect alone that made him dangerous. It was his ability to navigate power without appearing to chase it. Cromwell was a servant, always a servant to Cardinal Wolsey first, then to the king himself. But his service was strategic, calculating, and remorseless. When Wolsey fell from grace, most assumed Cromwell would follow. Instead, he adapted, and in that adaptation, he found the blueprint of survival at court. Destroy others before they destroy you. He became Henry VIII's architect, not of buildings, but of political survival. It was Cromwell who orchestrated England's break with Rome. It was Cromwell who dissolved the monasteries, tore down centuries of religious tradition, and replaced the Pope's authority with Henry's divine supremacy. It was Cromwell who engineered the downfall and execution of Anne Boleyn, once queen, now traitor, her legacy shattered in a single stroke. And yet, for all his power, all his efficiency, Cromwell made one fatal miscalculation. He believed the king was rational. In 1540, Cromwell arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a Protestant German princess. The match was a political masterstroke. On paper, England would be allied with German princes against Catholic Europe, and the Protestant Reformation would be strengthened. Cromwell's influence would deepen, but Henry found and physically repulsive. Flanders mare, he called her, coarse, horse-faced, unworthy of his bed. From the moment the king met her, the marriage was doomed, and with it, Cromwell's position. Henry's rage was not just sexual, it was psychological. To be tricked, embarrassed, made to feel weak in the eyes of his court. This was intolerable, and someone had to pay. Cromwell's enemies, long waiting in the shadows, stepped into the light. Chief among them was the Duke of Norfolk, uncle to the ill-fated and Boleyn and master of old nobility. He hated Cromwell, not just for his rise from nothing, but for daring to rewrite England's religious and political DNA without noble blood. Together with conservative factions at court, Norfolk whispered poison into the king's ear. They called Cromwell a heretic, a traitor, a self-serving tyrant. They reminded Henry of the bodies Cromwell had piled up over the years, of fortunes seized, monasteries gutted, allies discarded. And perhaps most dangerously, they reminded the king of how much Cromwell knew. By June 10th, 1540, Cromwell's downfall was set in motion. That day, during a council meeting, he was arrested without warning. One moment he stood as Earl of Essex and Lord Privy Seal. The next, he was dragged from the chamber, his badges of office torn from his chest. Witnesses later said he cried out to the king, even as the guards seized him, "This then is my reward for faithful service." There was no trial, no defense, only charges drafted in secret and signed in silence. Imprisoned in the tower, the same tower where he had sent so many, and there in the shadow of the scaffold, he waited. He knew the process, he had designed it. Now, what was being used on him? In Tudor England, death did not arrive quietly. It was a slow, suffocating approach, a series of deliberate degradations designed to dissolve the person before the body was ever touched. For Thomas Cromwell, the weeks leading to his execution were not merely imprisonment. They were annihilation. Once he entered the tower, Cromwell ceased to exist as a man. Titles stripped, letters intercepted, allies silenced. He became a name on a list, a target on a ledger. The very machinery he had built to destroy others now turned against him. Every policy of silence, every cruel innovation of mental torment he had once wielded against in Boleyn, Thomas More, or the Carthusian martyrs now enveloped him. There were no formal interrogations, no charges read aloud in court. Instead, a bill of attainder was passed, Parliament's cruelest legal invention. It declared him guilty of treason without a trial, bypassing the legal theater altogether. Cromwell, the former master of legal manipulation, would not even be allowed to defend himself. The irony was savage. He had transformed England's laws to serve the king's whims. Now those same laws swallowed him whole. The accusations were sweeping, contradictory, and strategically vague. Heresy for his Protestant sympathies, corruption for accepting bribes, treason for allegedly plotting to marry Princess Mary. None were proven, none needed to be. In the king's court, the accusation was the sentence. From the tower, Cromwell wrote desperate letters. Please, no protest. In one, he begged Henry for mercy. Most gracious prince, I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy. These were not the words of a hardened schemer. They were the words of a man crumbling under the weight of betrayal, appealing not to law but to memory. He reminded the king of his service, of the Reformation, the wealth seized from the monasteries, the enemies vanquished. But Henry did not reply. Silence, after all, was one of the most effective tools Cromwell had once used. Now, it was being used against him. As July approached, rumors swirled through London like smoke that the king had ordered the execution personally, that Cromwell's enemies would parade his head through the streets, that even in death his legacy would be erased. The scaffold was being prepared, the crowd was being summoned, but the mood in London was not celebratory. Cromwell was no longer widely hated. In fact, many commoners admired him, not for his cruelty, but for his reforms. He had brought down corrupt monasteries that taxed the poor, He had supported English Bibles, allowing people to read scripture in their own tongue. He had elevated men of talent over birth. To some, he was a tyrant. To others, a champion of reform. But to most, he was at least intelligible, a man who moved visibly through the corridors of power. Now he was being executed in the same way he had dispatched others, swiftly and with no explanation. It didn't sit right. By July 28th, 1540, the city was restless. This would not be a quiet execution in a shadowed courtyard. This would be a spectacle, one designed to reaffirm the king's power, but one the king would not attend. Henry VIII was already celebrating his marriage to Catherine Howard, barely hours old, as the man who had once ruled his council was being prepared for the block. The order had been given, the scaffold had been built, but what the king hadn't anticipated, what no one anticipated, was that this time the crowd wouldn't play their part. It was July 28th, 1540, a summer morning hung heavy over Tower Hill, warm, windless, and eerily quiet. The air carried the scent of smoke, and sweat mingled with the lingering iron tang of blood, a familiar perfume for Londoners who had witnessed the king's justice many times before. But this morning was different. The scaffold had been raised higher than usual, its wooden frame stark against the pale sky. Around it, thousands gathered, nobles cloaked in silk, merchants in worn doublets, laborers elbowing through the crowd for a glimpse. Vendors sold ale, children climbed onto crates, priests murmured quiet prayers for the condemned. And yet something was missing, the mood. There were no jeers, no gleeful heckling, no bloodlust crackling in the voices of the crowd. Instead, a cold tension had settled across Tower Hill, as if the city knew on some ancient animal level that what was about to happen was not justice, but something else entirely. When Thomas Cromwell emerged from the tower, he looked broken. His robes were plain, his hair disheveled. His face, once so sharp, so controlled, had collapsed inward, as if weeks of psychological torment had hollowed him out. He carried no dignity in posture, no defiance in stride, but neither was there shame, only the look of a man who had understood far too late the true cost of proximity to power. He mounted the scaffold slowly, carefully, pausing once as if to steady himself. The executioner stood nearby, hooded and silent, gripping a heavy axe polished to a gleam. Not the sort of noble death, but the crude tool of disgrace, requiring strength over precision, force over skill. There was no platform for speeches in the official script, and yet Cromwell spoke. "I am come hither to die, and not to purge myself. I die in the king's good grace, and I pray God save him." His voice was weak at first, then steady. There were no grand condemnations, no protests of innocence, but neither was there guilt. It was the confession of a man who had long lived by shadows and had now stepped into his final light. What happened next was not in the king's plan. Silence, then a sound no Tudor sovereign wanted to hear. Sobs from the crowd, from the commoners even. It was whispered from among the yeomen who lined the execution path. One woman near the front collapsed. A man raised his voice, not in protest, but in prayer, and then more murmurs, cries not for blood, but for mercy. Someone, an old soldier perhaps, was heard to shout, "This is no traitor. This is murder." The words didn't last long. Guards moved swiftly, but they had been spoken. The court expected cheers. Instead, they heard grief. The mask cracked. People began turning away, not out of squeamishness, but in silent protest. Some crossed themselves, others removed their caps. It was the ritual for mourning, not execution. In Tudor England, such a gesture was not trivial, it was subversive. When the executioner raised his axe, a hush fell, not respectful, but fearful. The first blow missed the spine. Cromwell didn't scream, or couldn't, but the failure was evident. A grotesque spray of arterial blood struck the executioner's arms and splattered across the boards. A second blow, then a third. The job, as always with an axe, was ugly. The crowd, uncharacteristically, did not cheer, they recoiled. A few vomited. A priest near the scaffold dropped his rosary. It had all gone wrong. In that moment, the king's power no longer looked divine. It looked cruel, panic-driven, human, and perhaps worst of all, regretful. The Tudors understood better than most that power lived and died in perception. Execution was not just punishment, it was storytelling. Every scaffold was a stage. Every decapitation, a carefully orchestrated punctuation mark at the end of a royal sentence. The dead were not merely killed. They were transformed into villains or martyrs by the state's chosen narrative. But on July 28, 1540, that story broke apart because Thomas Cromwell's death did not make sense. This was a man who had reshaped England, who had built the king's authority into something divine. He had silenced the Pope, shredded centuries of Catholic tradition, made Henry the supreme head of the church, and filled the crown's coffers with wealth stripped from monasteries. He had delivered in Bullen's head on command, and, more importantly, delivered a new political order to those who understood the stakes of his work. Even among the common people, Cromwell had been feared, yes, but also admired. He was proof that intellect could rise above blood. A man who started as a nobody and ended with the king's ear, a merchant turned minister in a country where blue blood was still sacred. To kill such a man without trial, with no clear treason, no rebellion, no public scandal. This wasn't justice, it was panic. The crowd instinctively understood this. They were not nobles, nor lawyers, nor courtiers, but they knew injustice when they saw it, and they had seen it before. They had wept for queens, once beloved and paraded like goddesses. They had murmured discontent when Queen Catherine of Aragon was cast aside. They had heard rumors that wives and advisors were disposable, and now, watching Cromwell fall under the same blade he once wielded, they saw the pattern. This was not about heresy, it was not about treason, it was about a king who had grown afraid of his own creation. Cromwell knew too much. He had been too successful. He had moved from tool to threat, and like all threats in Henry's England, he had to be unmade completely. His name blackened, his alliances dismantled, his body made an example. But there was one flaw in the plan. Cromwell died with dignity, and dignity is dangerous because it creates doubt. Doubt about guilt, doubt about the justice of kings, doubt about the entire scaffolding that held the Tudor regime together. Cromwell did not curse the king. He did not protest his innocence. He bowed, he prayed, he submitted, and that quiet submission, that measured grace, made the execution look not like victory, but like regret, like punishment meted out not for crimes, but for convenience. The whispers began almost immediately. He served the king too well. If Cromwell can fall, who is safe? The axe is hungry, and the king is never full. Even inside court, the tremors were felt. Cromwell had enemies, yes, but he had survivors too, those who had ridden his coattails into power. Now they scrambled to erase their alliances, their favors, their shared victories. Letters were burned, conversations denied, loyalties shifted overnight. The execution had worked, but not as intended. It had killed the man, but it had damaged the myth. For years, the Tudor regime had sold the image of Henry VIII as a god among men. Powerful, benevolent, infallible. But gods do not panic. Gods do not kill their most faithful servants over an unhappy marriage. Kings do, and weak ones at that. The image cracked, and when the people saw that crack, they looked again and saw a man. Not a deity, not a hero, just a man with bloodied hands and a dwindling number of friends. He never intended to. Kings did not watch their tools be discarded. They ordered it, then looked away. To witness might suggest hesitation. To hesitate might suggest guilt. But something Henry could not ignore was what followed. The silence. Not in the square where sobs and gasps still lingered in the dust and blood, but in the court where servants stepped more carefully, where trusted advisors began to second-guess their words, where a once omnipotent monarch sensed something had shifted and couldn't quite name what, but he felt it. In the hours after Cromwell's death, Henry remained in Whitehall Palace, newly married to Catherine Howard, a celebration meant to erase the day's darker proceedings. There was music, there was laughter, there was wine. But beneath the polished surface, the king's mood was brittle because something had happened that no advisor could explain away. The people had mourned. The execution had not purified the realm. It had poisoned the narrative. Within days, word reached the palace, not just of grief, but of discontent. Street ballads emerged. Anonymous, dangerous things that called Cromwell a martyr and questioned the king's justice. Some even suggested divine punishment might follow. The scribes at court moved quickly. The chroniclers omitted the crowd's reaction. The official version described the execution as orderly and reverent, with no mention of weeping, no mention of doubt, just another clean removal of a traitor as sanctioned by the king's will. But Henry knew better. He had built this system, and now he could feel its walls buckling inward. The irony was cruel. It was Cromwell who had once controlled the kingdom's information, who had curated the narrative, who understood that killing someone wasn't enough. One had to kill their memory too. And without Cromwell, that machine broke down. There were no public rebuttals, no counterbalance, no minister to spin the execution into a lesson, no loyal mouthpiece to flood the city with pamphlets reinforcing the justice of the king. What remained was a vacuum, and in vacuums, truth becomes unstable. It was said that Henry grew morose in the weeks that followed, that the vibrancy of his new marriage dimmed almost immediately, that he grew short-tempered, prone to isolation, consumed by a strange guilt that even his closest courtiers dared not mention. Because what haunted Henry most was not that he had executed Cromwell, it was that he had needed to. To kill Cromwell was to confess, however subtly, that the king had lost control, that his own architect had begun building rooms in the palace too far from the throne, that Cromwell had known too much, moved too fast, grown too powerful. And in that power, the king saw a reflection not of strength but of dependence. Because Cromwell had not merely been a servant. He had been a scaffold of legitimacy, the brain behind reforms, the mouth that defended royal divorces, the pen that rewrote the laws, the hammer that struck enemies. In executing Cromwell, Henry had amputated a piece of his own authority, and the body politic, like any living thing, responded with shock. Historians debate whether Henry regretted the decision, but evidence whispers yes. Within weeks, the king began issuing proclamations that hinted at reconciliation with reformers. He punished almost none of Cromwell's allies, some he even promoted. And in private, he was reported to have said, "I have put to death the most faithful servant I ever had." Not a declaration, a confession. But no amount of royal remorse could reverse what had been done. The political system Cromwell built, one of ruthless efficiency, public intimidation, and narrative dominance, had suffered a fatal contradiction. It destroyed its own architect without the tools to justify why, and the people noticed. At court, the aftershocks were felt for years. Nobles who once competed for Cromwell's favor now moved more slowly. The court grew quieter, colder. Ambition didn't disappear, but became cautious. Men who might have risen like Cromwell now built smaller dreams. Those who had tasted proximity to power remembered the sound of that axe, and how no one, not even the king's right hand, was safe. Henry had always ruled through fear, but after Cromwell's death deepened fear into paranoia. He trusted fewer men and listened to fewer voices. He married again and again, executed again and again. Wives, friends, ministers all became suspects. All fell under the shadow of the same sharpened axe. The crowd at Cromwell's execution had done more than cry. They had reminded Henry viscerally, unmistakably, that he was being watched, that his power was not divine but human and therefore fallible. In Tudor England, that realization was more dangerous than treason.